I had a chance to play 4 hours of Towa and the Guardians of the Sacred Tree in an exclusive preview with Bandai Namco last week, and I'll be sharing everything I'm able to from my experience of throwing hands as Nishiki the Jacked Fish to casting spells as an absolute unit like Benpuku. By the end of this video, you'll have a good idea of whether this is the next action roguelite to add to your list of must-plays for the year or not. Before I dive into specifics, I think it's worth noting that as a massive Hades fan and as someone who's eagerly been awaiting the 1.0 release of Hades 2 and having played over 100 hours of early access, I'll just say that Towa has scratched that itch to some degree, so stick around to hear my complete thoughts on what I was able to sink my teeth into in this preview session. To set the stage, let's quickly start with the world in which Towa and the Guardians takes place and our main characters. The village where story elements will take place is the village Shinju, named after the same god that the villagers worship, while Towa is a child of the gods who protects the people of Shinju and is the character we'll be using to navigate in the village itself. The evil god Magatsu, on the other hand, has been spreading his miasma, poisoning the mana and giving rise to creatures known as the Magaori, which make up the enemies we'll be fighting across runs. At the end of each run stage, you will face off against one of Magatsu's lieutenants, known as the Magatsu-hi. Towa has assembled 8 trusty companions dubbed the Prayer Children to aid her in stopping the spread of this corruption. Armed with a sacred sword and staff, gifted to her by the god Shinju, these weapons will define the 2 distinct roles the Prayer Children take.
So, in order to make it to Magatsu, the Tsurugi and Kagura will need to forge a path first.
You mean the sword-wielding Tsurugi who cuts down the Magaori, and the Kagura who protects them using magic?
Exactly.
These 2 roles are essentially the main DPS sword using Tsurugi, and the more generally support and utility-focused mage Kagura role, though there are options to play that role a little more offensively. Playing as both of these at the same time is a pretty interesting dynamic, but I have some issues with it as well. So let's talk about combat in a little more depth since this is the core of the game experience. Similar to Hades' weapon aspect system, with Towa you instead have your 8 Prayer Children to choose from, who when selected as a Tsurugi role, will have 2 different attack types that correspond to their sword types, with the red being the Hanzashi and the blue being the Wakizashi. These weapons will have a durability meter that degrades with each attack, forcing you to switch weapons once fully degraded, or you deal massively reduced damage. By using the quick draw attack button, which is also unique to each prayer child, you'll then perform that special attack while switching to your alternate weapon and simultaneously repairing the original weapon completely. While I think this concept is neat, I found myself often just sticking to one of the attack styles, as very often it felt distinctly better than the other in most scenarios, so I would then just try to force upgrades to the style I favored, making it even better. On top of that, the weapon degradation system was almost a complete non-issue, as I was even using weapons with next to 0 durability and was able to just do a quick double quick draw to recycle back onto my main weapon in under a second to continue using it. As for these character-specific attack movesets, I was able to test about half of them, and some of them definitely felt much better to use than others, with some feeling incredibly clunky. For example, when using Nishiki, some of his combos felt like they would lock you up in long animations, making it difficult to dodge, or at least it didn't feel nearly as good as when I started to run Akazu or Mutsumi, who were significantly more responsive and quicker to execute their attack. Maybe there's some fine-tuning still to be done to polish these movesets up, but for now I think there will be some clear favorites in terms of who to focus as your Tsurugi. As for the Kagura side of things, I'm a little more torn on how I feel about having the magic and utilities bound to another entity completely that I semi-have to control manually myself. In Towa, your health pools are shared between your 2 characters, and both of them can actually take damage, making it necessary to actually position your second character properly, which is much easier said than done. Normally, when you dash or run, the tethering system in the game will try to pull your Kagura with you to dodge attacks, but it often trails slightly behind, making it incredibly frustrating during boss fights to dodge attacks by reaction rather than being proactive and moving away. This is likely a combination of skill issue on my side, just not having enough reps with the new system, but I do think that this is a major gripe and weakness in the combat system that lends itself to being somewhat more RNG if the tether pull when you dash doesn't go where you're hoping it should. You are able to manually control your Kagura for movement and spell aiming, but it is an absolute nightmare trying to move both characters at once, and if they stray too far from each other, the tether will hold one of them back. This can also happen when you have your Kagura cast a spell that holds them in place for a windup, which also leaves them fully vulnerable to attacks, so it's something you'll constantly have to be mindful of. I don't think this is inherently bad design, but the learning curve and skill ceiling on this is going to be incredibly high, if there is in fact a way to play effectively by manually controlling both characters. But for the average player, I don't see this being feasible, and you're going to have to be a lot more careful about how you pull your second character with you to avoid damage, especially in boss fights where they can just get instantly nuked if you don't position them well. At baseline, each prayer child also does come equipped with 2 unique spells that can be swapped out using upgrade materials, but those will likely be better spent elsewhere early on. An important thing to note is that upon completing a run, your Tsurugi will perform a sacrifice ritual that will remove your Kagura from that run from the pool of playable prayer children, forcing you to think carefully about who you want to bring with you through to the harder runs of the game. If there's someone you aren't too keen about playing, you're better off using them in stages 1 or 2 as your Kagura to get rid of them faster. In terms of enemies, I think the general mobs were reasonably fair to fight, with some of the elite mini-bosses being pretty tough, though with only 4 hours to play, the meta progression in the game was very minimal, making all fights much more challenging than they probably would be after a few more runs under your belt. One of my only issues is that the indicators for attacks often felt less helpful than useful, as the range indicators, especially for the Magatsuhi, were pretty bait in terms of where they would actually attack. I think part of this has to do with the viewing angle, the fact that indicators are on the ground, and that the attacks themselves are actually being fired from higher up in 3D space, making for an awkward experience when trying to read the attack. This attack, for example, was on my final run where I fully thought I was going to be safe from the attack, only to be obliterated by it as it fanned out way more than I expected it to, based on the indicator. Overall, the fights were decent, but there was certainly a greater emphasis on dodging very powerful attacks with long windups, rather than a quicker back and forth dance from lighter and more frequent attacks during boss fights. Upgrades during the run itself come in the form of graces, which have a number of effect categories ranging from lifesteal to projectile deflection to knockback or lightning, many of these effects bearing a striking resemblance to boons from Hades, though at least with their own twists mixed in. Not to say that any game has ownership over these kinds of effects, a lot of these are things that you see in all types of games. An interesting addition is that the rarity of your grace is partially influenced by the speed at which you clear the area and minimizing damage taken, which I think is a really cool way to reward skilled play. These graces come in 4 baseline rarities, while the legendary graces can only be acquired by having a certain number of matching grace types first. Generally, the upgrades were decent, with some of them feeling very overtuned when you get a good setup running, which I don't mind personally, as it's always fun finding some incredibly cracked combos. I do, however, think that there are some improvements that could be made to the grace selection UI to give you a better idea of what category each grace belongs to, as it wasn't always explicitly clear, and I'd have to select the grace I thought I wanted to pick up, only for it to tell me I was going to replace one of my existing ones to do so, and then I'd just have to choose something else. Additionally, unlike Hades, which I think does this aspect much better, is when you do decide to replace something like your dash, for example, it would upgrade the rarity of that swap boon by 1 tier to make up for the fact that you gave up an existing perk that you already had, whereas in Towa, you just get the new grace and that's it. It would be really nice if they implemented something similar to Hades here. Finally, with regards to the run, there were a number of reprieve type areas to either heal at a hot spring, make camp, get a bite to eat, or shop, either providing temporary or permanent restoration or buffs from all of them. It was interesting having the option to choose between one or both of your characters to increase max health as one example. I found the foods to be underwhelming in terms of the buffs they provided, but it seems like there will be a long list you'll unlock that I assume will become much more potent further down the line. It did, however, have a favoriting system, which I believe will make that item that you select in your favorites more likely to show up in future runs, which is kind of cool. As for meta progression, there are a few aspects to touch on here, and in some ways there's almost too much going on. Certain pieces I was only able to briefly interact with, but we can break this down into 4 distinct categories that we know of so far. Most notable has to be the blacksmithing minigame, where you can craft your own swords to your liking, and there's a fair bit of skill involved with timing-based activities that influence the overall durability of the blade you create. It's pretty hilarious what you can come up with in this thing, but the final designs are purely for show. In a nutshell, the better you do on each stage of the blacksmithing activity, the higher the durability is, and then with that durability, you can improve one of the 3 aspects of the sword's performance. This might get tweaked on final release, but I found durability to not matter at all, so I was just dumping almost all of my durability in favor of massively pumping up my base attack damage, since that's what I was doing 90% of my damage with, so the thought process made sense here. My weapon was breaking every 5 or 6 hits, but swapping back and forth was so fast that it didn't matter at all, and I got a huge damage bonus as a result for the trade-off. Overall, I think the minigame is pretty fun and the design process is cool, but I could see it getting a little tiring after a while. With these swords, you need to manually equip them for every single character on both the blue and the red slot, which is also a bit of a slog. And I imagine it will be even more so later on as you continue to acquire even more powerful swords. The second way to enhance your character is through attribute upgrades in the dojo by spending Firefly ores, and this is a pretty crucial area to focus on for gaining critical upgrades like extra dashes for characters, especially those that don't have more than one dash already built into their kit. It's worth noting, however, the upgrades are exclusive to the prayer child you spend the ores on, so you're going to need to gather a lot of them in order to max every character out. The third place to upgrade characters is through the Eureka Tower, where you spend persimmon ores to buy inscriptions, of which there are a lot of options to choose from, and then you're going to have to slot them in yourself as well. Again, this needs to be slotted in for every single prayer child, so the process can become very tedious kitting out an individual character. The fourth place you can enhance your runs through is the Shinju Shrine, which is the equivalent of the Mirror of Night and keepsakes from Hades rolled into one place. At the shrine, you can use Jade ores and Adamantine ores for extra revives, making graces guaranteed or more likely to appear for a certain type, increasing rerolls for new areas, graces, or shop items, and a handful of other buffs. Thankfully, this applies to every character, making it a little less tedious to organize. However, you can't seem to refund any of the purchases here currently, so you may want to spend wisely. So that makes up the core of the true character upgrades, but around the town there are a handful of other NPCs to interact with that would give you other means of income or items that can be useful to progression. First is the shopkeeper Kenren, who is even more of a stingy prick than Tom Nook, and that's saying something. She and her loyal employees will offer various trades for ores and Tomasteels for making new swords. So you can move excess of one ore type desired to another, though you're usually going to want to only spend your Dominator ore on trades, as everything else is a bit of a scam and the ratios suck. Econ has a construction company that will allow you to upgrade buildings to increase ore drop rates, among other things, and Conroe runs a restaurant where she'll learn new recipes that you can consume for a price before starting a run for a small buff, and also encounter them during the run in areas where you can buy food. The final NPC I was able to interact with that provided something useful was the bird person Kay, who teaches you how to fish. The fishing minigame was incredibly basic. You literally just spam a button once the fish actually bites, and you're rewarded with fishing points based on your catch that you can then spend for Tomasteels and inscriptions at this point. Nothing groundbreaking here, but it's a solid additional source for more rewards and materials to progress. The main fishing spot in town seemed to increase the time between new fish sightings exponentially, so you could only really catch 4 or 5 without waiting an unreasonably long time for the next to spawn. I'm pretty sure that completing any run stage will reset this though. And that pretty much covers all the meaningful interactions you can make in the village. However, there's a lot of NPC dialogue you can go through, and I mean a lot. Initially, I was trying to listen to every single NPC interaction, but I was quickly running out of time doing this, and halfway through had to start speed reading the conversations to have enough time to make it to the limit we were allowed to reach for the playtest. Generally, the dialogue is fine, but some of it felt like filler, and some were very obviously tutorial-esque in order to help explain new mechanics in the game, but it often felt unnaturally woven in. Other bits of dialogue were a little cringe, but I will say that the place where the dialogue shines the most is when you're out on an expedition and your 2 prayer children sit down at the fire to chat. There seems to be a unique interaction between every single pair, and possibly doubly so if you reverse their roles, but I haven't had a chance to test that. These were much better interactions that gave you a lot more to work with in terms of learning about the characters and seeing them interact with one another as well. Initially, and even still to a degree, I wasn't particularly invested in these characters, as there's a lot to keep track of with all 8 of them plus Towa, and then all the other NPCs, but you definitely get more from them once you start doing runs with them. Overall though, I'd say a lot of the villager dialogue is forgettable, and you can easily speed through it without feeling like you've missed anything. That said, the voice acting itself was definitely solid for the English version, especially for the prayer children and Towa. Honorable mentions are the blacksmith and the annoying kid Enka in the village. He is actually a menace. Moving on to visuals, I think the world that's been crafted here and the NPCs are all great, and the art style is very fitting to the theme of the game. combat animations are pretty solid, and for the most part, I could usually tell what was going on, even if it was very chaotic. The enemies, especially the Magatsuhi, look super cool, and every prayer child has a distinct look, Origami's hat being a prime example. And I mean, Benpuku, come on, who wouldn't love this guy? The music is also great. The village music is very chill, and in combat, the music shifts to proper action themes. Overall, just very fitting and a pleasant accompaniment to tie the whole world together. Last but not least, I'll briefly talk about the story, but there's really not a lot for me to say given the restrictions on what I was able to play and what I'm allowed to discuss. All I can really say is that the general premise is standard good versus evil, but there are some interesting twists that will come along the way that I wasn't expecting. And I think that just about covers everything I'm allowed to talk about. From the short time I had to play Towa, I had a genuinely good time. I found the fights challenging enough to have fun with it, but it wasn't difficult enough to be frustrating beyond some of the more jank combat aspects I've already talked about. It is fun to have opportunities to put together some interesting builds with lots of room, if not too much room, for customizing loadouts to give this game some strong replayability. While I haven't seen anything past the Magatsuhi Muen, which is the third boss and the furthest we were allowed to go during the preview, my hope is that there's some sort of system similar to the heat system in Hades that brings more challenging modifiers into the mix once you've mastered all of the prayer children and are looking for something tougher. My biggest critiques lie in some of the useless dialogue that feels mid at best in the village, while the movement of using two characters at once and the tether system used to pull them being a bit jank, and then sometimes leading to what I believe is unwarranted damage being taken when it doesn't drag your Kagura where you think it should take them. That and the somewhat weird readability of area attacks are probably the highest on my wish list for things that should be addressed before or shortly after release. I'm hopeful for the actual launch on September 19th and think that if you're a fan of roguelites like Hades, then this would be right up your alley if you're looking for an Eastern mythology inspired take on the genre. Also, I can already see the sword making aspect going crazy once this drops with some absolutely absurd designs. That's all I've got for you today. If you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing for more coverage of your favorite current and upcoming games. If you play Elden Ring Night Rain and have been wondering just how good each of the relic effects in the game actually is, then check this video out next. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.